Welcome to the 139th Celebrity Synastry chart reading, where we will be looking into Dan Howell and Phil Lester. If you don't know me, hi, I'm Adeline, and it is so nice to meet you. On this channel, I look at the dynamic between two celebrities using astrology. For those new and returning, I take notes on a synastry chart looking at the personal planets, signs, aspects, and if birth times, available house overlays. I share these notes and add my extra insights and interpretations along the way. So if that sounds good to you, subscribe and click the bell to join us weekly, and let's get right into this one. Starting off with the sun, we have Dan's sun in Gemini and Phil's sun in Aquarius. These are both air signs. They are good friends and they share similar outlooks on life, which I imagine they would. They both have lived a very unique life together, you could say that, and would have a very unique, outlook on the way they see things, especially with like their career and all of that. They love to discuss ideas and there's an intellectual compatibility. They share social activities and they enjoy each other's company, which this makes me, I guess, think and see why they are so good on camera together, especially doing constant activities together, you could say. Dan's sun overlaid in Phil's 7th house. It's love-hate and they feel united together. I imagine they have a whole career and brand together. They are deeply moved by each other and they get in each other's heads. They sense that they are complementary and they subconsciously try to prove they are separate from the relationship, which is interesting. And I guess the way that is manifesting is, I'm not sure how often they do content together versus individually, but I imagine they still do that individual content and this together as well. So obviously doing that separate independent content would be, going away from their brand together and all of that. They feel the other is a big presence in their life, obviously. So they need to find balance to make the relationship work, which I don't think is surprisingly so, because not only they have a career together, they also live together. And I know it's been heavily rumored there are actually a couple together. I'm not sure if that ever was confirmed by them, but that is also, if that is an additional thing, that would be, another thing to add to this, because it seems like they're always together. They need that balance. They both may be driven to express themselves in extreme ways, and possibility of their personalities being lost in their relationship, which I think makes sense, because if a lot of their career or their time together is spent on the internet and, in the public place, you could say, obviously they're going to be a bit different when it comes to off the camera versus on the camera. Phil's sun overlaid in Dan's 8th house. There's a strong bond and there's emotional dependence. Phil is captivated by Dan and Phil may feel he cannot leave. Okay, this is a bit interesting. I guess we did see just before they're very much tied to each other, so I guess in that way, Dan has the ability to transform Phil. They both feel initially afraid of this relationship, which I feel could be in different ways. I think, especially with the way they met and everything, with when YouTube was just beginning, and I'm pretty sure both of them had a similar story of they were taking a bit of a risk with this. So I'm sure that would have been a part of it, because they're meeting in a bit of a risky period in their lives. And I think another element would be potentially if these two were their first sort of gay relationship, you could say, because I'm pretty sure, I'm not sure so much on Phil's end, but I'm pretty sure on Dan's end, he did say how he sort of struggled with all of that personally. So I wonder if, that would have been a sort of point of being a bit fearful with them. This could have been their potentially first real relationship, you could say. Dan may have come into Phil's life when he is at the bottom, and they both weirdly enjoy the darkness and depth of the relationship, okay? Dan's sun, Trine Phil's moon. There is honest communication and Dan relies on Phil's support. Phil relies on Dan's wisdom and there's a naturally cooperative relationship, not surprisingly so. Phil tends to be dependent on Dan. This is a bit interesting, considering we saw it seems like Phil is a bit captivated by Dan. He feels he can't leave and all of that. And he was at the bottom when Dan came into his life. It's sort of I don't know, I'm imagining knight in shining armor type situation. I'm curious to see where we'll go with this, because that's very interesting. They both feel they can rely on each other. Dan's sun, Trine feels Mercury. It's a great friendship and they have good communication. Dan accepts Phil and they both just get each other. They do business together well, again, not surprisingly so. Dan supports Phil's beliefs and they can talk through issues together. Dan feels he can think better around Phil and Dan gets what makes Phil tick. Dan admires Phil's intelligence and they understand each other on a basic level. They speak to each other with understanding and Dan allows Phil to express himself, which is nice. I'm glad, this sort of like dependency Phil has on Dan, I'm glad it's leaning towards being a bit more positive than not. Dan's sun opposite Phil's Venus. Their values conflict and they frustrate each other. I'm sure they would at some point. Dan will either not appreciate Phil or take him for granted. Okay, that's a bit interesting. Phil grows to resent Dan and Phil sees Dan as too dictatorial. I literally, as I said, this whole thing seems a bit more on the positive side. The U-turn comes along and it turns negative. Hard work is needed to make this work and Phil can play games with Dan. Dan's sun square Phil's Jupiter. They have different values. That's an interesting thing to have contrasting, because everything else we've seen, they seem to be pretty much on the same page, but values-wise, I thought they would be quite similar people, but that's there. They may overindulge each other and excess is from good intention. They have a strong desire to make each other happy and Phil has the ability to cheer up Dan. Both may expect too much from the relationship, which maybe this is just my take, but I feel like the expectations are kind of reasonable because I feel like they are quite successful when being a team together. Maybe this is in terms of other areas of their relationship. They both encourage the other to self-indulge and be impractical. Dan's sun opposite Phil's Saturn. Phil has the habit of parenting Dan, so there is a sort of reciprocated dominance, that's not the right word, but dependency with both of them. It seems like for Dan it's a bit more we've seen, but it's also we're now seeing Phil, being a bit more the parent figure. For Dan, that would be some kind of dependency on him. It's a relationship of duty and obligation. I mean, yeah, from what we have seen so far, the business, the collaboration, the cooperation and all that, it's not surprising to see because obviously they have their brand together. Dan's identity might become suppressed and Dan feels blocked and discouraged by Phil. Interesting. Phil has the tendency to criticize and nag Dan, and Dan is initially attracted to Phil's maturity. Dan's sun opposite Phil's Uranus. Separation occurs. Whether I feel like this is the not first time, I'm sure, but I feel like with most of the readings we do here, when we see separation occurs, it's of course, they're both traveling people, but I feel like with these two, they seem to be always kind of together. As far as I know, obviously they travel together because they do all the tours and everything and a lot of projects together. I'm 99% sure they still live together. And allegedly, I don't know if it's confirmed, but there's a lot of rumors that they are actually together. So I'm not sure where separation would occur here because it seems like they're together all the time. It's an exciting relationship and the relationship starts quickly, which I feel is not really surprising because it seems as a viewer around that time when British YouTube in particular was starting, it did seem all the relationships and friendships started very quickly for what it was. Dan feels burdened and Dan finds Phil to be insensitive, which I feel this would be coming from the sort of, dependency Phil has on Dan where he feels burdened, but also we did just see that his identity becomes suppressed and he's feels blocked and discouraged by Phil, so that's there as well. Phil will likely feel trapped by Dan over time. That's an interesting thing to be repeated, and that's there. Okay. Phil's sun trine Dan's Mercury. This is a repeated aspect, just inverted. So everything from before is further emphasized, but also Phil accepts Dan, which I feel like could be a bit debatable. I want to see a bit more on this because Phil doesn't seem to think that Phil accepts him. Phil supports Dan's beliefs and Phil gets what makes Dan tick. Phil admires Dan's intelligence and Phil allows Dan to be himself. Phil feels he can think better around Dan. Phil's sun opposite Dan's Venus, so this is another repeated aspect, just inverted. So again, everything is further emphasized from before but also repeated is Dan grows to resent Phil. I imagine this would be in terms of like the identity stuff and like, you know, Dan's identity and everything we've seen. Phil needs to learn to accept Dan and Dan sees Phil as too dictatorial. I assume dictatorial in terms of like, you know, Dan sees Phil as a bit too much of like a parent-like figure. Dan can play games with Phil and Phil will either not appreciate Dan or take him for granted. Phil's sun opposite Dan's Mars. Sparks fly, Dan is defensive. They both assert independence and they compete with each other. That would be an interesting dynamic to have because like they do have like a joint like brand and everything together, but they also have their own individual things going on. So I wonder if maybe they're competing like as individuals as well as being a team together. That's interesting. They get annoyed with each other, which not surprisingly so because they're together all the time. I'm sure there would be some, you know, annoyance there, or they may not, because we did see separation occur, so maybe there is a bit of like difference, you know, behind the scenes, you know, and everything. Phil's sun opposite Dan's Jupiter. There's a positive meeting and the sense of unreliability. I mean, we did see with the meeting that they're both initially afraid of the relationship, which makes me think there was a lot to do with like the whole YouTube thing in terms of the meeting, because the whole sense of unreliability at the time when they were starting, you know, it was that period where like YouTube was not a very serious thing. It was very much a hobby thing compared to like now, where it's like a lot of people will go on it to, you know, create careers for themselves and everything kind of guaranteed. So I think in that way, you know, going to YouTube would have been a very like unreliable thing for them to do. They have different life philosophies and there's a desire to make each other happy, which we did see the different values. So I wonder what the different values would be. I wonder if we're going to get in any indicator of what that could be later on, but that seems to be coming up. Phil sees Dan as unrealistic and Dan sometimes sees Phil as self-centered. They sometimes can expect too much of each other and Phil brings stability to this relationship. I mean, if he is bringing that sort of parenty type vibe to it, I'm sure that would come with it. Phil's sun conjunct Dan's Saturn. Phil is resentful of Dan. We're seeing it again. This is a weird thing, like that Phil feels trapped by Dan. It's a very weird dynamic. Like the only thing I can think of is like, I guess he would feel quite ingrained, you know, very like, you know, tied to everything, like because they've created so much together and I don't know how much like money there is in their brand together, but I'm sure in that way you would feel trapped, you know, in the business financial sense. They need to make time for fun, which I imagine would be, because we did see how they need balance to make this work. I wonder how much of their like time together is, you know, by themselves and like not for show or anything. They can overcome obstacles together and the relationship strengthens over the years. That's nice. I like that. They're able to depend on each other and Dan needs to learn to stop being so critical. Dan can be threatened by Phil's individuality, which I assume would be in terms of like, because we did see they compete with each other. Maybe he feels a bit threatened by, you know, Phil's independent success or something like that, because we've seen a lot more where Phil is more critical of Dan's like as an individual person character-wise. Dan has the tendency to repress Phil, which I think we did see on Phil's end for Dan, so that's reciprocated, I guess, them tending to repress each other. Great. Phil's vitality diminishes after being with Dan. What a interesting dynamic where they both seem to be like repressed as individuals. Like it's like being repeated on both ends. Dan needs to learn to not be so sensitive to criticism and they both feel they can have a stable relationship. Now for the intermission. This video is brought to you by me, my Etsy store, Adeline the Astrologer. If you ever watch this and think, hey, I would like her to read my Synastry chart, well, I will. I do personalized synastry readings on my Etsy store, both basic and detailed. The basic one is very simple to understand. It's not overwhelming at all. It's pretty good for those that are beginners to astrology, just getting the head around astrology, or just as a fun gift idea. The detailed one is just like what I do on my channel, just a lot of insight and interpretation on your chart. So if you are interested in that and everything else astrology and tarot related, readings and gifts, then definitely check out my Etsy store. Links are below. I'm always releasing new things, so definitely check it out if you're interested. You can even just favorite the store just to show your support for free. Thanks for listening, and let's get back to the reading. So now it's time for moon. We have Dan's moon in Gemini and Phil's moon in Aquarius. These are both air signs. Emotional detachment is not a problem, and they're comfortable with the other. They both value their intellectual companionship, and they may analyze their emotions together. Interesting. Dan's moon overlaid in Phil's 5th house. Dan sees Phil as perfect, and Phil is flattered by Dan. Dan drops his emotional guard around Phil, and Dan feels an emotional connection with Phil. Phil appreciates their emotional relationship, which from what we're seeing so far, it seems to be more emotionally detached than not, so I wonder how much we'll see a bit more when it comes to their emotional relationship. They both enjoy spending time together, and they have lots of fun together. I really hope so, because they do seem to spend a lot of time together, to the public eye anyway. Phil's moon overlaid in Dan's 9th house. Phil idolizes Dan, and Phil brings out the best in Dan. Phil feels Dan is out of his league, and there's a possibility for long distance. I mean, long distance in terms of they travel long distances together, I mean, I guess there is that potential of like them having their own individual projects they would have to travel for. Dan may become emotionally attached to Phil, and Dan may become dependent on Phil. So I guess in that way, maybe that is where Dan gets attached to Phil in that way, because we did see on Phil's end the way Dan seems to be dependent on him is in terms of like Phil being this parent figure. I don't know really anything about Dan's, like, I guess family life that I remember of. I'm not sure if he's ever spoken about that, but I wonder if, I don't know, there is some kind of like, you know, mommy daddy issues with this, where he's seeing Phil as this like parent or something like that. That's where my brain is going. They share similar attitudes on politics and religion, so I wonder where their conflicting values would be, because those are like the main points of like values where people would conflict in a relationship. So I wonder if we'll see anything else. There's mutual respect, admiration, and affection. Phil's moon Trine Dan's Mercury. They're comfortable talking to each other about everything, and it's a harmonious relationship. Dan enjoys being emotionally nourished by Phil, and Dan provides a foundation for Phil's feelings. Phil is comfortable expressing his feelings with Dan. Phil's moon is squared Dan's Pluto. Jealousy and emotional manipulation is underlying. With jealousy, the only thing we really have seen is like they can compete with each other. Otherwise, we haven't really seen anything. Dan can sense Phil's unconscious deeds and manipulates him with it. Dan tends to be controlling over Phil. I wonder if this is why Phil may feel trapped by Dan over time, because like we haven't really seen anything like too solid to say why, but I feel like this is pretty, yeah. They both need to let go of the idea that love only exists with control, and they both need to work through power struggles. Yeah, they have a bit of, like, they have each of them have a power over the other, but it seems like in different ways. Like, Phil has this parental thing, but Dan has this, I don't know, at least like knight in shining armor type of thing where he seems to have helped Phil. And in a way, like, Phil is kind of like holding that against him, because it's this weird thing of like Phil feels trapped here and like controlled by Dan almost in a way. I'm very keen to see more, because this Phil thing is very weird. Projection is a challenge. I mean, they're literally projecting themselves onto people, so I wonder if that's something of a challenge. I don't know, I might be reading too much into that one. There's a deep emotional transformation, and they may need to work through psychological demons. The only way I could really see this, like, allegedly some like issues on Dan's end with, like, I don't know, some family issues there, just with the way that he seems to be like treating Phil or viewing Phil. But also I imagine with like the whole identities and everything, and like especially like struggling like with being gay and everything. I don't think I ever watched Phil's like coming out video and all of that, but from what I remember Dan said he really struggled with it. So and they both would kind of, I imagine, understand that whole thing with each other. So I wonder, like, I imagine that would be the main point where they would work through those demons together and all of that and the struggles of that. So now it's time for Mercury. We have Dan's Mercury in Gemini and Phil's Mercury in Aquarius. These are both air signs. They have abstract conversations and they share detached and objective values. I'm curious to see where we will go with this whole values thing, because we've seen I would say pretty equal amount of like they share it, but they also contrast on it. It could just be potentially some they share, some they don't, which is pretty normal. They both tend to be argumentative and it's intellectually stimulating. Dan's Mercury overlaid in Phil's 6th house. Dan's mind is stable around Phil and Dan communicates with Phil practically. Phil thinks that Dan is reliable. We did see there is a sense of unreliability when it comes to the relationship, particularly with Phil and like him feeling like he's at the bottom when Dan comes into his life. I wonder if maybe there was an issue with like when they were starting out on YouTube that, you know, potentially Dan was a bit more successful and had like more reliability out of YouTube than Phil. And that's how they met and everything, and why Phil would see Dan as reliable and kind of like stick by him. That's where my brain's going. Phil sees Dan as a stable companion, which we have seen sprinkled throughout the reading. They do see each other as quite stable and everything together, so which is good. Phil's Mercury overlaid in Dan's 9th house. Travel, culture, and philosophy are common topics of conversation, which not surprisingly with travel, because I'm pretty sure they've done, I know they've done like world tours or like tours and all of that. So that is there. Philosophy, I imagine, because we did see like mixed things with like their values and what they agree and disagree on. We also did see, I think it was arguing is not uncommon. So I wonder if like debating on different things and like disagreeing, agreeing on different things is where that would come up, and where potentially like discussing philosophical matters and viewpoints and all of that would come up. Dan is impressed with Phil's knowledge and Phil gives Dan a greater perspective on life. Dan's Mercury sextile Phil's Mars. Phil encourages Dan to put his thoughts into action. That's nice. There's healthy competitiveness. I really hope the competitiveness is healthy. I mean, you would kind of really hope so, and I think lean towards that, because you know, it doesn't seem they're competitive in terms of like, because they have a brand together and all of that. And obviously they're an individual, like I was going to say individual companies, but like individual brands as well. So I imagine like sharing some success together would, you know, I guess lay off that sort of like deeper competitiveness of like, I'm better than you because you share something together and you work on something together, you know. I hope that made sense. They work well together and Phil can take things personally, and they inspire each other to improve themselves. That's nice. Dan's Mercury opposite Phil's Saturn. Dan needs to be patient with Phil and it's strong and long lasting. We're seeing again another pretty, like, I guess gluey factor in terms of like, it seems to be quite a stable relationship. There's deep respect for the other's intelligence, which I don't think I've commented on this yet. We've seen a lot of like intellectual things to this relationship, like they have this really good intellectual rapport, which it shouldn't really be surprising since they've like did a lot of work together, and a lot of work where you would have to think creatively and quite like intelligently, you know. Dan may feel intimidated by Phil's practicality, and Dan may feel like a child around Phil. Oh boy, that's interesting. Considering, like, we did see that, you know, Dan's feeling like a child, and we saw before Phil feels like a parent. Interesting. Natural communication is difficult, and both partners subconsciously enjoy their conflict. We did see right in the beginning that they both weirdly enjoy the darkness and depth to their relationship, so that is there. And in a way, another gluing factor, because we have seen like a few points here and there of like there being like conflict and all of that, so it kind of in a weird way is good that it's working for them, because we have seen a lot of positive things as well, so it's not in my opinion, not the worst thing, but yeah. Phil's Mercury square Dan's Pluto. There's frequent intellectual arguments, not surprisingly, so I did mention this. It seems like there is a good potential for like these two to be debating and all of that together. Phil feels controlled by Dan. I'm not obsessed of seeing this before. Like, Dan's a very interesting character in this. Both may hold onto issues for too long, and Phil is overwhelmed by this dynamic. I don't really blame him. He seems to be, I don't know, like, I don't want to say suffering here more, but it is a weird thing with Phil, like, feeling trapped and overwhelmed here. Phil wants to understand Dan deeply, and Dan wants to know Phil's secrets, which I feel like could be potentially related to, we did see how Dan, I think it was like sensing Phil's unconscious needs and manipulates him with it. So I wonder if in that would tie to it, wanting to know his secrets and all of that. Dan tries to control Phil's thoughts. It's there. So now it's time for Venus. We have Dan's Venus in Leo and Phil's Venus in Sagittarius. These are both fire signs. They fall for each other impulsively. We did see something in the beginning how it wasn't like falling for each other, but it was something like the relationship starts quickly or something like that, which I assume would be related. And I guess not really surprisingly so, because I'm pretty sure this whole time I've been like, they met around the YouTube period. I'm pretty sure they did, and wasn't like they met each other then like started YouTube together. And that, you know, would be a very unique place to be, like where the both of you are doing this very new sort of like, you know, impulsive, unreliable thing, you could say. You would, you know, at that time, you know, befriend anyone in that similar situation to, you know. The relationship starts quickly and they share a love of action and fun. They inspire each other, we're seeing again, and Phil's restlessness makes Dan insecure. Okay, wait a second. No, I don't like this because my brain remembered the whole, I don't know how I can forget, but like the whole thing we've kept seeing repeating, how Dan is being controlling. I wonder if that is coming from a place of insecurity, and like that is a very, I guess, stereotypical thing with controlling people. Like they want to keep tabs on the other person, and anything like a bit more like restless or adventurous can make them feel insecure and jump into like controlling mode. Dan needs therapy. That's what I'm getting out of this. Like Phil, yes, as well, I think, but you know, Dan I think he needs some help. Dan needs to understand Phil's desire for space. This poor guy, I really hope he's like, you know, worked through his issues and everything, and like, you know, this, and you know, we did see how they both work through psychological demons, so really hopefully that, you know, this is something that Dan has worked on throughout this, you know, relationship with Phil and all of that, in whatever way that is. But yeah, that's there. They always remember each other. Dan's Venus overlaid in Phil's 8th house. Dan is captivated by Phil and they have a transformative relationship, not surprisingly so. Dan is willing to do anything for Phil, and Phil has fantasies specific to Dan. So I wonder if this would be related to, in terms of like, you know, like video ideas and everything, and like, oh, I could have this really great idea. This is a great thing to do with Dan and all of that. Phil's Venus overlaid in Dan's 6th house. Phil feels they don't have much in common, which I imagine would be something that I think they would feel in the beginning. Like, it's sort of like when you're colleagues and like the only like common ground is like your colleagues, and otherwise you don't really feel like you have that much in common besides you're working in the same place together. I imagine that sort of would have been like at the beginning, like we're both stuck in this very unique position together in a sort of like, you know, work colleague sort of space. Dan senses Phil isn't really into him. I just, in terms of like connecting this with like Dan tending to be a bit more controlling, which seems to be coming from an insecure place, I feel bad. Neither sees the other as their type, and they're together as a result of duty or obligation. That would be a very strange thing, considering we did see that Phil feels trapped by Dan a couple times. I wonder if, like, I guess it would be a bit more in Phil's end where, you know, he's created a lot of this with Dan. Maybe from that place he feels obligated to stay with Dan. It's a helpful and productive relationship. Dan's Venus square Phil's Pluto. There's a fine line between love and hate. I'm not really surprised because we've seen a lot of good things to this relationship, but I feel like we've also seen an equal amount of like, I don't want to say hate as such, but I think a lot of like darker elements, you could say, to these two and how they, I guess, view the relationship in a way. Like Phil has this thing where he feels quite trapped in this relationship, and then you have Dan, it feels like he is in this relationship because he has this like, deeper attachment to Phil. Power struggles happen and they bring out each other's deepest insecurities. There's an intense fear of losing each other. I feel like this fear would be a bit more on Dan's end, but also, you would have to kind of put this on Phil as well, because we've seen he feels trapped here, so it, kind of would go hand in hand that he, feels trapped. He's probably afraid to leave for, because it seems like that whole obligation thing is there as well. They cannot be just friends after, and Phil has the higher power. So now it's time for Mars. We have Dan's Mars in Leo and Phil's Mars in Aries. These are both fire signs. It's spontaneous and passionate, and Phil gets irritated with Dan. Dan unlikely gets the admiration he wants from Phil, which, obviously in terms of like, Phil seems to be more, I don't want to say detached from the relationship as such, but like we did see like he wants a bit more space than Dan requires. It seems like Dan kind of has a bit more like smothering energy, you could say, and really wanting to be around Phil and keeping tabs on him, so to speak. So there's that. But we did also see emotionally, because we did see that it's probably a bit more detached. It seems to be a bit more detached on Phil's end than Dan. Dan seems to desire a bit more emotional detachment, which I don't think we really did see reciprocated by Phil all that much. They both enjoy the chase more than the relationship. Okay. Dan's Mars overlaid in Phil's 8th house. It is love-hate, and Phil feels possessive of Dan. I'm kind of, I don't want to say I'm happy to see this, but I'm glad that that is a little bit reciprocated on Phil's end, because that's just really sad and tragic if Dan was the only one feeling a bit, possessive here in a weird way, if that makes sense. It's transformative and they will never get over each other, which we did see a few things of they'll always remember together. They can't really be friends after. Dan feels drawn to Phil, and Phil feels like a damsel in distress around Dan, which I did say in the beginning, there is this weird knight in shining armor thing with Dan going on. Phil feels mesmerized by Dan and possibility of a taboo in the relationship. I mean, the obvious one is that they're allegedly a couple together, especially, I guess I was going to say especially in this day and age, but I feel like, it would have been around 10 years ago this all happened. Well, that's a bit wild, showing my age. But what's it called? The whole thing, is back in the day, starting to get a bit more accepted, but obviously anything LGBTQ plus related is still, seen a bit more on the taboo side of things. Phil's Mars overlaid in Dan's 11th house. Phil is detached when pursuing Dan. I wonder if this would be in terms of I don't know, he was seeing Dan be more successful and just reached out to him or something like that. Dan always feels out of Phil's reach. Really? Okay. Dan is intrigued by Phil's rebelliousness, and they both enjoy the freedom here. More so on Phil's end, I would say. I'm not sure if Dan is really enjoying the freedom Phil has, but that's there. Their Mars signs are trine together, so they give each other confidence and they're in sync. There's direct communication and they challenge each other to do their best, which we have been seeing. They both inspire each other and everything, which is nice. They feel they can do anything together and they do physical activities together, which I'm sure they would have done. I know they do a lot of sit down videos, you could say, of doing video games together and all of that. But I'm sure at some point they would have done some challenges together that are a bit more physical and everything. I'm sure on tour they would have done something like that. There's healthy competition and they energize the other when they are feeling low. Dan's Mars square Phil's Pluto. There are power struggles and external influences challenge them. I wonder if all the rumors from fans and everything challenged them. I'm sure that would have had some kind of influence on them, because those rumors are strong. very strong. Dan's blunt nature triggers Phil's inner issues and they dig into each other's psyche. There's a brutal transformation and they need to deal with their own issues instead of fighting. Yes, I agree. Phil's Mars, Trine Dan's Jupiter. They feel they can do anything together and there's a healthy competitiveness. Dan is okay with Phil asserting himself. I assume this would be in the sense of like, with Phil being a parent and that, scratching the itch for like the psychological itch for Dan, that whole potentially like issues he may have could be related to that. Hopefully that made sense. They have fun together and they enjoy trying new things together. They have a shared interest in sports and travel. I imagine travel with their touring and all of that. Dan helps Phil get out of his comfort zone. That's nice. Like, I feel like I'm not really surprised to see it though, because there is this weird thing of like, Dan being this sort of like knight in shining armor. Like, they both feel initially afraid of this relationship and all of that. It seems like, and there is also the element of like Phil feeling a bit more afraid of this relationship as well. So it seems like, related to the whole YouTube scene, maybe Phil was worried about taking that risk. Phil feels more energized around Dan and it's possibly a reckless relationship and they're a lucky couple. Phil's Mars squared Dan's Uranus. It's exciting but unstable and it's not long term. No. It's been pretty long term. In terms of like what kind of relationship, who knows. Phil gets easily irritated with Dan and they may encourage the other to be reckless. We're suddenly seeing a lot of like recklessness here. I don't know where that would be though, except in terms of like them having a YouTube career, you could kind of see as reckless, because as far as I know, in the beginning, like, did they have any other sort of like side gigs or anything? Dan sees Phil as a threat to his independence. I'm not surprisingly so, because we've been seeing a lot that Phil feels quite trapped here and Dan is quite controlling of Phil. Dan distances himself from Phil. That's wild. I mean, maybe he has these moments where he's like less in control and all of that. Phil's Mars squared Dan's Neptune. They need honesty to make this work, and circumstances in meeting were never understood by one of the partners. Which I feel like this would be leaning towards more Dan, because I think we did see how Phil is a bit more detached when pursuing Dan. So it seems like Dan would be more likely the one that didn't truly understand, the circumstances of the meeting and all of that. So that was the final aspect, bringing us to the end of the reading. If you are still watching, please share your thoughts below. I'd be very curious to see what you guys have to say, particularly if you guys are, bigger fans of them than me. Because I feel like, this couple more so I know a little bit more about. But definitely not as strong in the fandom, because I know there's a lot of fans that are very like dedicated to them, particularly the idea of them being a couple. I'm gonna feel like an absolute silly goose if they actually like confirmed anything. I'm probably living under a rock there, but definitely share your thoughts on this one. I feel like this was a fairly interesting reading, a bit deeper and darker than I thought it would be. And if you have made it this far, please consider subscribing for more. I post these readings weekly. And besides that, give this video a like and I will see you guys next time. Bye! And a shout out to my astrology enthusiasts, Monkey Girl and Sky Games Vlog Hawker. Thank you for supporting the channel. If you would also like a shout out and get early access to new videos, click the join button below to join the memberships. There are 2 tiers, the observers and enthusiasts. So thank you again, Monkey Girl and Sky Games Vlog Hawker, for supporting the channel.